today's event is the new media and the Palestine question, blogging out of conflict. A few months ago, Professor John Mearsheimer delivered an important lecture here where he said, the internet is a game changer. It not only makes it easy for the opponents of apartheid to get the real story out to the world, but it also allows Americans to learn the story that the New York Times and the Washington Post have been hiding from them. Yesterday, as many of you who are following this issue know, we awoke to the news of clashes in Silwan in the Palestinian village in East Jerusalem, where a settler guard fired on Palestinians and ultimately left one dead and others in critical condition. The Washington Post reported on this on page A12 this morning. The New York Times had it buried on page A6 again this morning. But yesterday afternoon, Robert Mackey, who's a blogger for the New York Times, posted a blog post on the New York Times' website reporting on blogging about this issue and what transpired, and the Twitter commentary and pictures being sent live from the scene about this issue long before any of this made it to print. And we are clearly living today in a different era where the images and information that were not being put on the front pages or sometimes even mentioned at all are available online almost instantaneously before an American audience that was previously not informed about this, about these happenings. And we have, as I mentioned in the opening, Twitter, which many people came to think rose in prominence because of the elections in Iran and the way Twitter was being used by protesters in the street. But months before that, as many people in this room and in this community know, we were following the minute-by-minute updates on Twitter, on various different websites, about the consistent happenings and tragedies in the war in Gaza. And so this type of information is revolutionizing the way we learn about this conflict. It's revolutionizing the way perceptions are created about this conflict, and may very well at some point revolutionize the way policy is formed about this conflict. So we've put together today a two-panel discussion with some of the most prominent bloggers on this issue. And the first panel will discuss the role of blogging on this issue on public opinion, and the second panel will discuss the role of blogging on policy, U.S. policy towards this issue, and whether or not the first translates into the second. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for the first panel, Will Human. So please join me in welcoming our first panel, who Will is about to introduce.
Thank you for being here today, and I want to thank all the panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to be here to talk about something that has become such a large part of their daily lives, for better or worse. I wanted to say a couple quick comments about what we mean by new media or public discourse, or at least the way that I understood this as someone who helped plan this event. It used to mean that new media referred to satellite television during a time when most broadcasting was tied down to the earth, to antennas and to cables. Satellite was a way for global media patterns of information and media to change directions and flow and have a much greater reach. Now when we mean new media, we refer more to the internet and the ability of the internet to fragment and distribute sources of information and to completely change the way that information has traveled around the globe. So blogs, for example, give individuals the ability to become publishers. There's many more examples of self-publishing. So, for example, social media. Yusuf talked about Twitter. Facebook has become a platform for people to develop their own networks and to communicate to their own networks, their own circles of friends, their own online communities. But there's countless others. There's Reddit and Digit, LinkedIn. There's multimedia capabilities that are now at the hand of average citizens, resulting in this concept of citizen journalism. YouTube, for example, where we post many of our videos. Podcasting, where individuals record their thoughts as an audio file and upload it for the world to hear. There's also web streaming and live streaming, which is what we're doing, a mix of real live time broadcasting and video and audio all at the same time. And on our website, people have the ability to comment in real time on this. So what's really going on here? What's all this about? Is there a structural transformation in how people have related to their media environment? I mean, for the first time, people have the ability to create their own media. Some communication scholars talk about this as the difference between lean back and lean forward media, and I think that's a useful concept for tying into the way public discourse is formed and emerged. Lean back media is when you're simply consuming. You lean back in your chair and you're just sort of taking in whatever is being broadcast to you. With lean forward with lean forward viewing or participating, you're actually taking part in constructing and writing and producing media content. And I think that that's what's really going on here with this new media environment. Whether it leads to any changes in the way that everybody sort of thinks about and talks about these issues is something that we want to talk about today. So some of the questions that we want to ask, thinking about this new kind of participatory culture of talking about public issues online, there's some questions that we want to think about. Does the net offer the opportunity for deliberation of issues, or do we sort of just excite our own passions and become more polarized? Are people siloed? Are we just listening to each other and not listening to what people of other views have to say? Are we being exposed to cross-cutting ideas? In other words, do we just end up kind of preaching to that famous choir? And if so, I mean, what does that say about the ability for all this new media stuff to bring about change? I suspect that a lot of the answers will be, I don't know, and we'll see what's going to happen. And we can only speculate about that. But I think we're also at the point where we can start to think about what specific instances and specific events and start to look at patterns and also think about whether there's changes in the sea. And that's what our panelists are going to talk about today. They're also going to talk about it from a personal perspective. So this is going to be a mix of the biographical, which I think is important because it ties in to why, the reasoning basically, and the kind of hopes and the logic and the philosophy of being involved in this new media warfare, some people call it, battle of ideas, some people call it. So our first speaker today will be Jerome Slater. He's a longtime professor of political science at SUNY Buffalo and currently holding the position of University Research Scholar. He writes on U.S. foreign policy and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for professional journalists, general interest media, and even his own blog, JeromeSlater.com. He's also a contributor to the Huffington Post. So this is an interesting example. I think Professor Slater is an interesting example of someone who has spent a long career working within old media channels, also within, scholarly publications, but who has made, a habit of being involved in producing his own sort of content. And then just so I don't have to introduce Adam between the speakers, Adam Horowitz will be our second speaker. He's the writer and co-editor of the website Mondoweiss, a news website devoted to covering American foreign policy in the Middle East, but chiefly from a progressive Jewish perspective. Before going to Mondoweiss, Horowitz was the director of the Israel-Palestine program for the American Friends Service Committee, where he gained extensive on-the-ground experience Israel-Palestine. So I would typify, or I would characterize his perspective as being more kind of an activist perspective. So hopefully we'll be able to put these two perspectives into conversation. Professor Slater.
Thank you, Will, and good morning. Is this going to work? Okay. The instructions, as well as indicated, the instructions to Adam and me were to provide a 10-minute introduction about where and why we blog and what got us into it, why we blog particularly about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and whether blogging should be considered activism or journalism or both. I'm not particularly comfortable about talking about myself, and I can see a little reason why others should be interested. But orders are orders. So I will briefly comply before we can move on to the actual issues, and I'll raise some of the issues in the course of this. I began blogging last December. Being an academic, I could only come up with a pedestrian name for the blog, which is the U.S. and Israel, and which can be found at, predictably, jeromeslater.com. Now, there were then, and even more so now, a growing number of excellent blogs that deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as with U.S. policies towards Israel. Especially, I may say, Mando Weiss, and when the mood strikes him, which is often, Steve Walt. So it may well be asked, I asked myself, what purpose a new one would have. Well, my hope was that as an academic who'd been teaching and writing about this matter, mostly for professional journals and professional political scientists and historians, my hope was that I could provide a historical perspective that would complement both activism and journalism. In particular, I think that there is a gap, and it's an unnecessary gap, between shorter daily comments that quickly react to recent events and long articles written for professional journals. So my hope is to help bridge this gap by writing shorter essays, principally in the 4,000 to 5,000 word range, in which I, based on research and scholarship, not mine or others, but aimed at general audiences, not written in academic prose, and reasonably closely tied to current events, instead of things which are going to appear 2 years later, if at all, in a professional journal which is only going to be read by a handful of professionals interested in the topic. Just as one example, a couple months after the publication of the Goldstone report, I wrote 2 fairly long analyses of it on my blog. Now, aside from that, in addition, from time to time, when some especially outrageous event occurs, I mean, outrageous events in this topic are daily, but one particularly outrageous one appears, or there's some particularly noxious right-wing article is published, or there's a typically misleading and half-truthy New York Times story appears, I'm unable to resist commenting on it in shorter pieces that are more typical of the blogging world. Now, the problem with my type of blog, of course, is that it doesn't appear on any regular or predictable basis, unlike Mando Weiss and Steve Walt, who I don't dream of going a day without reading. So it's difficult to gain a regular readership. But there is a terrific feature of blogging programs, including the program I use, which allows interested readers to sign up to be notified by email when a new blog appears, so they don't have to just check it. If something comes out that looks interesting, they'll get an email and decide whether they want to read it. So why do I blog on this particular issue? Over the course of my life, I've gone through 3 phases about Israel. Coming of age in New York City in the 1940s, immediately after the Holocaust, and with anti-Semitism still alive in America, I thought of myself as a fervent Zionist. I guess in a sense I still am something of a Zionist, although a lot less fervent, since I regarded the case for the creation of a Jewish state, if nothing else than as a refuge for persecuted Jews, as a compelling one. Because this immediately gets to the problem of where, and so I never thought of it as the case is not necessarily in a land that's already populated by others, obviously the Palestinians. So you have to separate those 2 components, difficult as it may be to do. Now, in light of the history of the Jewish people, perhaps this bedrock principle of Zionism, a refuge for Jews who really need a refuge, is still, if not compelling, at least not to be dismissed, understanding the long history involved. However much it has been betrayed, and betrayed is the right word as far as I'm concerned, by Israel. While still in my first phase as a fervent Zionist, at the end of the 1950s I served as an anti-submarine warfare officer on a U.S. destroyer. And in the late 1950s, Egypt bought 4 subs from the Soviet Union. So I wrote to the Israeli embassy and I volunteered to serve as an ASW officer on one of the Israeli destroyers in the event a new war broke out with Egypt before the Israelis could train their own people. But at the same time, my views began to change, and I entered into my second phase. Why? Three things occurred. First, I began to read about, in a serious way, the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, as opposed to its mythology, which I, as almost everybody else, had accepted. Secondly, it soon became apparent that soon after the 1967 war, Gamal Abdel Nasser, before Sadat, was seeking to end the conflict, both of them, but they were being stonewalled. At that point, I felt like writing to Golda Meir and saying that if Israel blundered into an unnecessary war with Egypt, which of course it soon did, on me she should no longer depend. And third, at the same time, Foreign Affairs published George Ball's famous article, How to Save Israel in Spite of Herself, and it had a quite profound influence on me. These three factors impelled me into my second phase, the tough love phase, hoping that truth-telling would eventually convince the Israelis, and equally as important, probably the American Jewish community, that Israel was on the road to both a moral and security disaster and needed to come to terms with the historical truth as the first step, actually the sine qua non, of saving itself. But in the last few years, and this is quite hard to admit, let alone to say out loud, I no longer believe that tough love can work, and I no longer can say truly that I love Israel, as opposed, of course, to the many wonderful and courageous Israelis who still resist what their country has become. I no longer think Israel can be saved from itself, and it certainly cannot happen unless the American Jewish community itself, with its enormous influence on American policies, comes to grip with the true history of the conflict. So in short, Israel is no longer on the road to a moral and security disaster. It is already there, and I see no realistic prospect that it can reverse course. It is hard to see how a two-state solution can be reached, and the one-state solution, in quotes, to my mind, is no solution at all, but a fairy tale, which if somehow actually materialized could well be even worse than the present situation. Well, for me, that leads to the obvious question, so why bother to write about it? Well, part of the reason is illustrated by this story. One day, the governor was touring the state mental institution, and he came across a man who was completely naked, except that he had on a very elegant black top hat and beautiful black dress shoes. "Why do you run around naked?" the governor asked. "What's the difference?" the man responded. "Nobody ever comes to see me." "Then why the top hat and the dress shoes?" "Somebody might." In that spirit, I now write in the forlorn hope that truth and justice might yet prevail despite my deep pessimism. But equally, and maybe more so, I also now write in the spirit of not in my name. If you are a completely secular Jew, like me, it is hard to see what the point is of being Jewish, if not to uphold the best values of Western civilization. There was a time, there was a time when it was widely accepted, and not just by Jews, that the Jewish culture and tradition was one that was particularly committed to the best values of Western civilization: reason, truth, justice. Consequently, when Israel was founded and committed itself to be a light unto the nations, a few people sneered at that. No longer, needless to say, the appropriate response to what Israel has become is outrage, and so maybe that's the main reason why I continue to bang my head on this wall. Finally, is this activism or journalism, or both? I don't know. But as a lifelong academic, I prefer to think of it as scholarship in the best sense, the search for knowledge, reason, truth, and justice. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. Thank you so much, Professor Slater, and thank you, Will, and the Palestine Center. I'm going to take a slightly different tack with my remarks, although during question and answer I'll be happy to answer any sorts of questions. I'm not going to really talk so much about sort of my personal, why I'm involved in this issue personally, but sort of how Will introduced me, that I come from more of an activist background. That's true. Before working at the American Friends Service Committee, I helped start an organization called Jews Against the Occupation in New York City, which was very much involved in sort of on-the-ground activism, protesting, things like that. The AFSC, as many of you probably know, is a much larger nonprofit organization. It did work both around the United States and in the region itself. And one of the things that struck me from that experience is doing that type of activism was extremely effective in working with people one-on-one and moving people one by one and doing work in the region that's really necessary and doing work in the U.S. that's really necessary. And yet it still always felt that there was a larger conversation happening about the issue that we weren't really involved in, or occasionally we would be able to break into that conversation, but this larger discourse around the conflict, around what's happening on the ground, was one that we weren't really involved in as activists. And so when I made the decision to leave AFSC and get involved with Mondoweiss, one of the reasons for that was to get involved in this conversation, to help change the way that the conflict is understood, discussed, and the news that people get to discuss it with. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the site itself, although I'm happy to, but just to say that, Professor Slater talked about the incredible work that he does on his website, and we play sort of a different role. I mean, one of the roles that we play on Mondoweiss is just a news aggregator. We get news that people send us. The best case scenario for me is when we get news directly from the region, like we did yesterday with the protests happening in Silwan, and we're able to publish that. Getting out news that you really don't get in a lot of other places except on the web. I'm not saying only on Mondoweiss, but like in the introduction, that it's not in the newspaper in the same way. I think one of the other important roles that we play, and this is something that we could talk about during the discussion as well, because it hasn't really come up yet, is that we are a meeting place for people who are interested on the issue. One of the things that I hear often from people who come to Mondoweiss, who read Mondoweiss, is, in my community where I am, I don't know anyone else who thinks the way I do about this issue. That might be a little hard to believe here in D.C. when you have places like this, like the Palestine Center to come to, or I'm in New York, and so there's a lot of opportunities. But, there are a lot of people in other parts of the U.S. and other parts of the world who don't have that sense of community, and they are able to come to a website like Mondoweiss or many others and feel that they are a part of something that's larger, and that, that they aren't crazy. Or maybe they are crazy, but there are other places that they could go to discuss this. So I think that's one of the other important roles that our site and sites like it play, and something that the internet provides in a different way than other organizations or other kinds of things I've been involved in. Something though that I wanted to share to kind of kick off this conversation, because our first panel here is about that discussion around the discourse and the role that sites like these can play in it, is I just wanted to read a section from a chapter that I wrote along with Philip Weiss, who is the other co-editor of Mondoweiss, for a book called Midnight on the Mavi Marmara, which is a wonderful book if you have a chance to pick it up. But we wrote a chapter in there about how the growing understanding of conditions on the ground in the occupied territories is shifting the discourse around how the conflict is discussed and understood. And this is going to be referring to the Israeli attack on Gaza, Operation Cast Lead, and the assault on the flotilla. The awareness of the conditions on the ground was seen in a shift in the discourse surrounding the flotilla attack, especially online, as internet journalists led by Ali Abu Nima, repeatedly expose Israeli Hasbara. This awareness penetrated the establishment media as well, as the New York Times website. On the New York Times website, Robert Mackey's lead blog cataloged the work of those discrediting Israeli spin. He highlighted Max Blumenthal's reporting on doctored IDF audio and Noam Shezov's work on Turkish photos on the Mavi Marmara that contradicted IDF claims. Other significant reporting included Leah Terechansky and Max Blumenthal's work disproving IDF claims that the flotilla was linked to al-Qaeda, Jared Malson's work confirming the use of the doctored audio, and Abu Nima's reconstruction of the path of the Mavi Marmara to show that it was actually fleeing at the time of the Israeli attack. Despite the Israeli Foreign Ministry's best efforts, these internet journalists were able to shape the story and fill crucial voids in the narrative of the attack that persisted in large part because Israel refused to release the entirety of the video and still footage that it confiscated from the flotilla passengers. In the past, Israel's control of the story of the conflict, especially in the West, had been the source of enormous power. But now we see that power breaking down at an incredibly swift rate. The one quote-unquote success of their Hasbara efforts was a racist We Are the World knockoff video that really only confirmed how absolutely tone-deaf many Israelis were to feelings around the world. In another age, novelist Leon Uris helped supply a narrative of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that survived for generations, but today that story is being told over the internet. Portions of the attack on the Mavi Marmara were broadcast nearly live over a live stream video channel online. In addition, several filmmakers on board were able to smuggle off footage, most notably Iyar Ali from the Cultures of Resistance project, and that footage helped contradict the official Israeli version of events. So far, Israel has not found an effective response to this democratization of the media. And who knows, before long, people might even start discussing how Gazans ended up in Gaza in the first place, the Nakba of 1948. I mean, who's going to believe a land without a people for a people without a land when there are at least 10 YouTube videos to prove it wrong? I'll just leave it at that for now.
So I thought that this was kind of an interesting panel. For one reason, I mean, coming from a Palestinian American perspective, myself, to bring in some biography, having grown up in a home where there was a Palestinian American activism, so growing up going to kind of meetings with my parents and protests, one thing I remember from those days is that the meetings were pretty homogenously Arab American, Palestinian, and there might be sort of one or two non-Arabs in the room marginally. But when you go to Mondoweiss, for example, you see, and as Adam pointed out, a meeting place for people. You see a different kind of demographics. And this blog was launched from a Jewish American perspective. Professor Slater's own story of personal development around the issue points to this kind of intersection between my Palestinian American experience and a Jewish American kind of perspective or experience. So my question to both of the panelists is what extent is new media serving as this kind of facilitation point for these different communities? And is it interesting that with that those silos that exist around discourse of the two-state solution are kind of breaking down, within the new media platforms like Mondoweiss?
Yeah.
That's your question.
Sure. Well, to start off, I would say, in terms of breaking down those silos, that there are two ways that we try to do that. I mean, one was in the way that I referred to, and you just referred to, just in terms of the interpersonal interaction that people hopefully experience in some way on the site. In that, the meetings that you went to, meetings that I've been to as a Jewish American activist, they tend to be pretty homogenous. And so on the site, we do hope to see that it is really sort of mixing of people. One of the other things that we try to do on the site as well, though, sort of more in the discourse realm, is to bring the Palestinian perspective, both Palestinian American, Palestinians on the ground, into the conversation. I mean, it's amazing, and I'm sure most of the people here, have seen this, recognize this fact, that for all the conversation that goes on around this issue, around this conflict, very rarely are Palestinians allowed to voice their own reality. So one of the things that we try to do, of course, both for our own readers in raising these voices and raising these realities is share that, but then also to hopefully insert it into the larger discourse, which, for better or for worse, I would say for the worse at this point, as Jewish Americans, we have more access to those outlets, and we're certainly given more leeway on our site to say things that other people would be criticized for. Something else I meant to say during my introduction to get to the second part of your story around the two-state solution. One of the things that we also hope to do with the site is to air the ideas that are not being allowed into the discourse otherwise. I mean, I think one of the powers of the internet versus before the internet and before websites is there were very few gatekeepers that would be able to decide which ideas were worthy of conversation. So whether the editorial board at the Times or at the Post or another newspaper, now there's still the hope to be able to get into those spaces. But if you're not in those spaces, there are still plenty of places to have this discussion. And so, I mean, we publish a lot of things on the site, not all things that we agree with, but we want the site to be a place where the ideas that are not being discussed or being aired have a chance to be discussed, because there's a lot of both information and ideas out there that are where I really think is the most interesting thinking is happening right now. You would never know it from looking at the mainstream media.
Professor Slater, I know that you've written some studies comparing, for example, New York Times and Haaretz, finding that there's more criticism of Israel within the Israeli press, and finding that the lack of differing opinions within U.S. mainstream media, it can kind of explain maybe why U.S. foreign policy remains around this kind of disastrous consensus as you describe it. I'm wondering if you in your own work and your own blogging, but also in what you're reading in terms of blogging, do you see this more kind of feedback going on between the Israeli press kind of via bloggers, like bringing the circulation of ideas in the Israeli media into the American political discourse?
I think there has been a little bit. I don't know how much of that is a function of bloggers in general, or how much of it is that this issue is so important, covered on an ongoing basis, that dissenting opinion somehow can't be stopped from seeping in. Every once in a while, you'll even see a story, usually by Tom Friedman, citing Haaretz columnist, although it's usually the wrong columnist. It's Avi Shavit or somebody like that. So I think that there is something of that is happening. It's a very slow process, and just focusing on the New York Times, which I've been writing about in one form or another for some years, you do find somewhat more, only somewhat more balanced coverage. But then you have op-eds by travesties like Ephraim Kosh, who's supposedly an Israeli scholar, but he's a propagandist. That's why it doesn't necessarily name names. I mean, haven't counted the ratio, but probably the ratio of editorials, pro-Israel, in quote, editorials and op-eds to critical ones is still, I don't know, 3 to 4 to 1, something like that. But that 1 out of 4 is still, I think, something of a change. You can't exaggerate this too much. I mean, the Times has always bowed occasionally to the opposition point of view on this, and so if there's a change, it's only somewhat. But I think there's a larger point here, and I know this is going to be the subject of this afternoon's discourse, so I'll just say it very briefly. I think that there's no question that the discourse on this issue is changing. I don't know how much I have no way of knowing how much of it is due to blogging, but it stands to reason that it does. I mean, Mondo Weiss and Steve Walt and MJ are quoted all the time now. And so this has to have an impact. So if you ask, is it having an impact on discourse? Yes. If you ask the more important question, is it having an impact on policies? The answer is no, not that we can see. Now, the groundwork may be being laid for something to be changed, and it's a very important, crucially important to lay this groundwork. But we're not there yet. I mean, I noticed that Mondo Weiss, especially Phil, will occasionally publish something from somebody who says, in effect, the light has fallen from my eyes. I now see the world as it is, and Phil says, "We're winning. We're winning." Well, not really, not yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if one of the problems with thinking about discourse is this kind of separate thing that's going on. It's kind of own thing that's going on that's completely separated from sort of reality or real politics or real policy. If maybe the missing link is institutions. And the more time I kind of spend writing my personal blog, the less time I'm spending being involved in actual organizations and institutions that are sort of the traditional, make up the traditional stuff of foreign policy pressures and that kind of thing. So I wonder to what extent is there a trade-off between new media use and institution building? Either one of you.
Well, there shouldn't be. I mean, because they're both very important. I mean, not everybody can do everything.
Yeah.
Steve Walt could do everything, but I mean that's just another category. Nothing. I see nothing wrong with making a choice based on whatever your personal. So either build institutions or write or do both, but both of them are very useful.
So is Mondo Weiss an institution in the classical sense, or is it this new media monster that's decentered and people are sort of just writing a bunch of stuff, but there's no kind of social action or collective action that comes out of it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I didn't really answer that question in my introduction about the balance between journalism and activism. The way that I look at it is that the website is not an activist. Mondo Weiss is not an activist entity, although we do cover and highlight a lot of activism that's going on. We do share our opinions about issues. But I mean, wearing my activist hat, and what I encourage people to do, who I know, and anyone here and anyone who's watching, is please send us information about the work that you're doing. I mean, that we are an alternative outlet for letting the world know about the activism that's going on. I mean, something like the BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, that's one of the biggest stories that we cover and that we've written about. That's a story that is now just starting to get mentioned and crack into the mainstream media, but it's been a huge story for years now. And it has been through these alternative outlets like the websites here and other ones that have let people know what's going on and let people know the actions that they could be doing and getting involved in. So a website like Mondo Weiss is in no way to replace activists and other traditional organizations, but I would hope that it would be a wonderful tool for those institutions to use.
Okay, and you have J Street now, so you have the building of, I mean, you had American Peace Now before that, but they are not useful on this subject. And J Street could be a lot more useful, but at least it's a start I mean, all of these institutions have the problem of not being too far out in front of their general constituency. At the same time, remaining just ahead. Are they ahead enough of the consensus to be relevant? And that's is another issue. But they're in a delicate position. But you do have some of the institution building going on now, right? Within the Jewish community.
Yeah, and new communication technologies obviously serve the purpose of institution building. I wanted to talk a little bit about Mondo Weiss's very impressive website statistics. I know these numbers might kind of cause people's eyes to glaze over, but I'm very interested in this stuff. Alexa traffic ranking has it as in the top 60,000 global websites. 60,000, that doesn't sound like an impressive number, but in light of 5 billion and a billion new websites every day, that's pretty impressive. In the U.S., it's in the top 17,000. In Israel, it's in the top 15,000 websites. So what's the secret to Mondo Weiss's success?
Yeah, please tell me.
You're gonna make me blush. The secret to our success, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think that one of, I should also say, and I didn't say this earlier, but in terms of a little bit of the history of the website, My partner on the site, Philip Weiss, started the site in 2006 when he was working as a reporter with the New York Observer. When he left the Observer, he took the site with him. And the site was about all sorts of different things, including Israel-Palestine. And sort of over time, it has become more exclusively-ish focused on Israel-Palestine. I joined about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago. And I think that one of the things that we do well is that we produce a lot of material. I think that, when I mentioned earlier in terms of the aggregator role that we play, one of the things that I don't think I fully appreciated coming from an activist background, because when you're an activist, or I am an activist, you look at something like the New York Times and you're like, oh, it stinks, they're never going to have good coverage, and never expect it to have good coverage. But I'm really amazed by the number of people who come to our site who feel profoundly let down by the mainstream media on this issue and other issues. But folks come to us who, for the first time went to the West Bank and saw the conditions on the ground and were just shocked because they felt that in no way were they prepared. By the discussion here in the U.S., they had no idea what the conditions on the ground were and wanting to know, why is that? Why aren't we told what's happening over there? And so they end up at our site looking for that news. We're certainly not the only site that does that, but I've been really amazed by just how hungry people are just for news. I mean, I think people stay for the conversation and the ideas, but people know there's a story out there they're not being told, and the internet gives them an incredible resource to find that out.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I mean, I agree that Mondo Weiss performs a number of useful functions: analysis, mobilizing people to the same views, and so on. But a critical one, certainly a critical one for me, is appearing daily with 10 or 15 items and calling attention to all kinds of things that you're not going to see relevant issues. You're not going to see anyplace else. So it's a tremendous resource for those of us who are interested in keeping up with what's going on and don't want to rely on the mainstream media. And it must take and that has been expanding all the time. I mean, so that Phil and Adam have opened the space up now to others to write in on this. So it's not just a question of reconciliation and so on and so forth. It just is an enormous informational resource, which I think is good. And there really is no other blog that does quite the same thing, I don't think.
There's other websites, for example, you're involved in Huffington Post, but you can think of other these kind of mega sites that bring together many different bloggers and have very impressive website, reach. Do you feel like you have more access as a contributor to Huffington Post compared to, say, like old media, for example?
Well, not to go into a biography, but I'm no longer a contributor to Huffington Post.
Oh, okay.
They stopped publishing my stuff, and when I asked why, I didn't get an answer. That was an answer in and of itself. So my experience with Huffington Post was about 2 or 3 months.
Oh, okay. Were you getting a lot of feedback from those articles? Or?
I thought so. But yeah, I mean, there were. I mean, you look at you write about something particularly strikes somebody, you can get 100, 150 comments. Most of them not very interesting, and many of them the same people arguing back and forth. One of the things I notice about commentary on the not on the Huffington Post, everywhere, particularly in Mondo Weiss, is that the first 2 or 3 comments comment on what was written, and the next 150 comment on what the commentators are saying, and the same people keep making appearances and so on, and so it's easy to tune out. Now I don't know what could be done about that. I'm sure that Phil and Adam have thought about that problem. How much do you control that, and how much? I don't have this problem. I get maybe 6 or 7 comments on what I write.
Yeah. See, I wonder if given how much information is out there, and the fact that there's all these sources, and it's on all different sides. I mean, what do we still have the potential for, like, a kind of, how George Ball's article had a big influence? The one article had a big influence on you in an old media environment. I mean, does the fact that there's so many different sources out there, and we're getting, we're checking our Twitter account and Facebook and all these things, we're not giving them maybe the same attention that we would give the magazine issue, a paper magazine issue. I mean, is that also kind of a trade-off leading to maybe, is it harder to have this kind of effect on someone like
Well,
that?
I mean, it's your generation that can multitask. I have enough trouble single tasking, so I can't answer that question.
Yeah. You want to say anything about that?
I mean, I guess all I'll say about the comments issue is for me, I mean, there's different ways to measure the reach, influence of the site. I mean, it's been interesting because when I started with when I started with Mondoweiss, and there would be some posts that would get 10 comments or something, and then there'd be the posts that would get 150 comments. And so I immediately thought, well, the post with 150 comments was sort of more popular, more people read it. But then you see that that's not the case. So when I spoke earlier about the sense of community that a website is able to engender, for me, that's what the comments are. That's the place where in a lot of cases, people who kind of know each other, or they know each other by their name and they know the kind of perspective they're coming from, sit around and talk about the issue, talk about the post, fight with each other, whatever they're going to do. But that's entirely different from everyone who's read the piece and other ways that it's being used. So I think, I mean, it is an issue in that the comments become a public face of the site in the way that our actual content is. And that's an issue that we've run up against, and people have criticized us, and it's an issue across the blogosphere in terms of people being judged by the comments that they generate. But to me, it's a different kind of function than the material that we put up. It's sort of, in a way, the community that the site, engenders around it, which we can really only control to, a certain extent.
All right. At this point, I wanted to open up for the audience. I also wanted to invite those who are watching via webcast to contribute questions through the Twitter account or through the chat room that's on our webpage. So you feel free to submit questions both ways. So do we have the microphone ready for the audience? Okay. We have a question up here.
My name is George Hishmi, and I'm a journalist. I worked for the Washington Post at one time and for the Chicago Sun-Times. What is the problem? Is it the problem in how we are educating journalists to do their stories? Is it the editors? Or does papers have policy and the journalists have to follow their line? I mean, I've noticed, for instance, like Anthony Shadid has moved from the Post to the New York Times. His articles are fantastic. How does the New York Times accept these kind of in-depth pieces of life in Baghdad, in Iraq right now? And yet they would not do something similar. They do sometimes on Palestine-Israel question. Where is the problem? Is it in the education, the schools of journalism, or is it in the ownership of newspapers and the media? Thank you.
Maybe we'll take a couple.
Yes, my question is about I think the isolation almost of the blog atmosphere, and why don't things get into them? I'm concerned about the Goldstone report that you mentioned, and the total public trashing and discreditation, whatever, of the report and Goldstone himself. There was a lot of support in the blogs and the internet traffic, but the Senate, or the U.S. Congress, rushed to discredit, and Hillary Clinton also. My concern is, why wasn't there more transfer from the blog atmosphere to the public media so that the public could see what was actually in the report and not have this rush to discredit it?
Well, I just try to respond briefly to both questions because they're related. I don't know how newspapers work. I'm not a journalist. I'm not have any connection with it. But it seems to me obvious, at least in the case of the Times, probably in the Washington Post, probably all of them, that that there are certain views that are held by those in power, or else they don't want to antagonize what they consider to be their main readers and maybe their main advertisers, for all I know. I imagine this is more important in this day and age when they're all suffering. And they're only willing to go so far and no further. And if you get something which is really explosive, like the Goldstone report, which actually, in my view, I wrote about that, understated the case, not overstated the case. It just runs up against this wall of partly ideological. We don't want to hear it. It can't be true. It's too extreme to be true, therefore it isn't true. But also, it has to be paper policies. Now, whether it's the publisher or the editors and so on, and they would run, and especially I guess today, they would be running serious risks if they were to really be determined to find out the truth and reveal it and let the chips fall where they may. It's one thing for a retired professor to do it, and another thing for a newspaper which has to survive and which reflects, no doubt, the actual real views of those who have power.
What would the risk?
Losing money, I would imagine. Losing readership, losing advertisers.
Oh, wait, we've got the microphone. We need the microphone. Horowitz.
I mean, I don't want to add too much, and sort of similar to what Professor Slater said. I mean, I don't know the answer to how newspapers
As
work.
retired professors, I'm just Jerry is good enough now.
Okay, Jerry. So I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it feels like the big questions that we're looking at today, and we'll certainly be looking at this afternoon, is why didn't all the attention that Goldstone was given in the blogosphere, why didn't that translate? And the question could be, why didn't it translate into the mainstream media? Why didn't it translate into Congress? And I just think coming from, I think about this from a movement building background. I mean, the time between introducing new ideas and changing the discourse and playing around with the way that people understand an issue to when that changing in thinking becomes an activated and successful social movement, I think that takes time. I mean, to be able to move people from, I used to think this, to now I think this, to I'm going to start devoting my time and effort and resources into getting this changed. I think that that is a process that's been happening for a long time. I think the internet is giving that a huge boost, and our numbers are growing immensely. But there's a lot of catching up that needs to be done as well. So I think the way that you interact with these institutions, say the New York Times versus Congress, are obviously different. But it's extremely important that everyone is having that interaction and complaining about coverage when it happens, or talking to representatives when votes like that around the Goldstone report happen. And it might be somewhat naive, but as our numbers continue to grow, that those balance of forces will begin to change, and hopefully the result will begin to change as well. But I do think that we are still relatively early, in that process, and that we shouldn't expect, 180-degree change in results right away.
Okay. We just have 15 more minutes, so let's take about 3 questions. In the back there, and then in the back there.
Hi, I'm with Yes We Can Middle East Peace. So often we talk about humanitarian concerns, which everybody is interested in, and we talk about specific issues having to do with Israel and Palestine. However, just recently, Lockheed Martin just made one of the biggest deals with Israel that's ever been known in history. So the question is, how does the consideration of the military-industrial complex impact the peace process?
We have a question right there.
My name
Oh, wait for the microphone.
Sorry, microphone.
My name is Jesse Bacon, and I edit theonlydemocracy.org, which is another website dealing with this conflict. And I just wanted to ask you, Adam, how do you kind of deal with, you're presiding over this huge community, not just of commenters, but all the different people who write for the site, and how do you preside over that community and solicit posts and make editorial decisions and things like that? If you
Okay, and then one back
I would really like to thank you very much.
Adam Horowitz for having Mondoweiss, and I'd like to give a really quick example. I think it was before you came. In the D.C. area, we had a situation at a bookstore, Politics and Prose, which disinvited Sari Makdisi, who is Grace Saeed's nephew. So she sent an email out to a lot of us, and we got lots of letters saying we're regular supporters of Politics and Prose and we're very upset for whatever reasons. But she said that what really turned the tide and got him re-invited to talk about his book, she said she would sell his book, but not, this was Carla Cohen, but would not allow him to speak initially. But what really turned the tide was Philip Weiss's getting lots of letters from Jewish people to her store. And so my question to you, I'm a person of a certain age that I certainly go to the internet, but I don't very often go to blogs. I have a lot of friends who read the New York Times, the New Yorker, Vanity Fair, the Washington Post. They do not read Mondoweiss. How could I convince them to read Mondoweiss more?
Go ahead. Did you have any response?
Well, I was actually wondering.
You got a big problem, I'm afraid, yeah.
Jerry, I was wondering, would you like to respond to the military?
Well, yeah, very briefly. I think that whenever you have an ongoing policy which involves sale of arms and other things, you're going to have economic interests involved whose interest they think is in continuing that policy. But I don't think this is the main explanation for the continuation of policy. I think what the main explanation here are beliefs and ideologies. And in the Jewish community, which I think is decisive, because there isn't going to be change in American policy unless there's first change in the American Jewish community, given the role of the Jewish community in that policy. That you have to change the way I'll say, think about it. I mean, our speaking for the Jewish community, is that basically about all the things that you hear about, that this can't be true, right? We are the victims. It can't be true. We don't behave that way. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to see it. I don't want to know about it. Whatever you say is counteracted. You say this, but somebody else says that, and it's very hard to get past that. And that's much more important than vested interest, really.
Any other questions you want to say?
Yeah.
Or, we're going to answer a couple more of those.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say something about those two questions. First, for Jesse's question, I have to say, when I first started on the site, and even before I started, it used to be the case that Phil wrote everything. And then I joined the site, and me and Phil wrote everything. And one of, I think, our greatest accomplishments with the site now is that on any given day, we might post one or two things that we write ourselves, and the rest will be contributions from different people. And it's, I mean, I joke that on my to-do list for the last year has been come up with a contributions policy. But I just haven't had the time because we get too many contributions. And I think once we started publishing other people, people would just send us things. And I just think that it has become a wonderful megaphone for voices of, some pretty incredible writing that I feel like we're able to publish. That it's just pretty incredible to me. Hasn't been able to find an outlet elsewhere. So, there are cases when there's a story in the news that we know folks over in the occupied territories or inside Israel that we definitely want to get that perspective, and so I'll solicit something for them to share. But oftentimes, just wake up in the morning and see what's in the inbox, and people just send us, just amazing, beautiful stuff to share with people. And then for the comment over here, about politics and prose and that story, it's funny because when I hear that story, what I think about that Mondoweiss, or in the work that Phil did there, is pretty inconsequential. Really, the work that happened there was the work that you did and the work that Grace did in terms of getting, doing the work around that issue. All we did was highlighted. And if it wasn't for people doing the work like that, we would really have very little to write about, because we're really just a reflection of all the good work that's going on out there. And what to tell your friends? I would just tell them, especially if they're interested in this issue, that there is a lot more to the conversation than they're getting in those other places, and they would probably be really excited if they knew what it was.
Okay, sorry, gentleman in the suit, and then there's so many hands in so little time.
Thank you. I just want to thank the panelists for their comments. My name is Rafael Calles, and I'm the director of the Institute for Palestine Studies here in Washington. One thing that bothers me, and I've witnessed over the years, because I monitor websites like everybody here from all sides, different political opinions and all that. We pass a lot of the judgment of what is there on the internet and in blogs and on Twitter and Facebook based only on the English language aspect of these websites. Now, I monitor also the Arabic websites, newspaper websites. I monitor viewpoints from Palestine, from Gaza, from Nablus and elsewhere on a daily basis. And sometimes I get a completely different picture of what people think, what they say, how they feel, than what I read on the English language websites. And I think a lot of the studies I've seen on the blogosphere here in Washington by think tanks and by experts are all based on the English version. Do you see a solution for this problem to build up and get a clearer picture of what people think out in the field? After all, these are the people who count. And keeping in mind that many of those on the English websites that you all read about are actually educated, intellectual, Western-oriented in their thinking. They understand the West, and they might give you a wrong impression of what the rank and file in the street is saying and feeling. Could you comment on that?
Okay, let's maybe get a couple here. The gentleman in the front here had his hand up for a while. So,
sorry.
It's okay if you could just hold on 1 second. Microphone.
I'm Gene Bird. I'm from the new International Foreign Policy Center on Capitol Hill, which tends to bring NGOs together from around the world, and we'll be dealing with global issues. I talked with John Mersheimer recently and said, John, you've given us a reason why nothing works and that the policy is bad. What would you suggest President Obama do? And he came back right at me with a very succinct, he should be talking to the Jewish American community. Now, our experience has been one time only. We get into synagogues, we get into reform, we get into personal conversations, and somehow or other they get turned off by the extremists. And this has happened to me at 2 universities, Temple and Northwestern, and just a small fringe can destroy the conversation. What use, and this is my question also, besides how do you reach out to Jewish Americans, but how do you translate hits into foreign policy?
Any other questions?
Indeed, yes.
Right here.
Jerry Bird. I'm from the Northwest, and we spent 3 weeks last month in Oregon and Washington State. Our friends know what we have been doing for a long time on this issue, and yet when I ask the question, how many do you think in the state of Oregon read the New York Times? The general estimate was 1 out of 100. There is no interest in the boondocks in those periodicals. And it occurs to me that the important thing for the new media to do is to somehow use the old media to get their message out. And I would like to know what you would think about the idea of small ads in local newspapers saying, if you want to know more about, go to whatever website, or other ideas of that sort. I just wonder if you have that more take on this.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure that I really have anything to add to what I've already said. I mean, I certainly agree with the gentleman. Is that how do you translate hits, or how do you translate, put that somewhat more broader into a politically effective group, or different views which can make its weight felt in the electoral process in Congress, and President, and so on. And that's what I say I'm pessimistic about, because I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that happen. And therefore, the only, unless the kind of thing you're doing and the kind of things that bloggers are doing is continued, then there's no hope, because all of the political weight is on the other side of the issue. How to change that, and whether it can be changed in the short run, I'm quite pessimistic about. But there's no hope. What else is there to do? So there's no hope. I mean, there are vital things are at stake here: moral issues, security issues, for the United States as well as for Israel. What are you going to do? Keep going and take your lumps and hope that at some point it begins to permeate. That's yeah.
I guess in terms of the questions, first for your question, I totally agree with you, and I think it would be a wonderful project for someone to be able to take on, to be able to begin to translate some of that material that's being written in Arabic to make it more accessible to a wide audience in the U.S. Because I do think that those perspectives are essential, and with this technology that we're talking about, there is an opportunity for that on-the-ground perspective to be heard. It won't be heard, at least widely, as long as it's only available in Arabic, but that this is an incredible opportunity to influence the discussion, because I totally agree that that's not being heard right now, except in a few isolated spots, and we try to do that when we can. I think the idea around advertising is a great idea. I wish we were able to do it. Money is always a concern, and we don't have a lot of it. We have been starting to experiment with some online advertising in places like Facebook, which is really inexpensive, and you're really able to target audiences that you know will most likely be interested. So that's one thing. And I mean, finally, the question around the Jewish community is a huge question, and is honestly probably a different event. I guess all that I'd recommend at this point, and something that we try to do on the site, and I'm not sure exactly what you go and say, but one of the things that we try to focus on is values. If you hold values of equality, of democracy, of freedom, these are the conditions in the occupied territories, and your own values are being betrayed by the policies that our community is supporting. I think that is a pretty compelling conversation to be had, and I also think and have seen that sometimes, at least at this point, that's a conversation that's going to be most effective happening internally in the Jewish community at this point. That being said, I also want to add that while I don't want to pretend that the Jewish community isn't important in this, because they clearly are, but this isn't an issue that only the Jewish community can move. I mean, this is an issue for all of us. I mean, at least all of us who are U.S. citizens, our tax money is going to support this. So as long as that's the case, I mean, no one should be sitting around and waiting for the Jewish community to change its mind, because there's a lot more people out there and a lot more stakeholders in what's going on.
So we only have a couple more minutes here, so gentleman here.
Okay, Mark Braverman. Hi, Adam. I just want to follow up on your last comment, Adam, and but I was originally going to ask this question, and want to ask this question of you, Jerome, and it may be more of a question for this afternoon, And so I want to, if I get the chance, I'll ask MJ and Stephen as well. And you just touched on this, Adam, but my question is, and I feel sometimes like a dog with a bone about this one, is not how to reach the Jewish community, but why it's important to reach the Jewish community. I mean, you said it twice, Jerome. Why is it important to turn the Jewish community around, if that's possible, in order to move forward to resolve the conflict?
Well, I mean, I have some differences with the Israel lobby theory of Steve and John Mearsheimer, but the differences of emphasis, I think that there's no question that, well, I don't want to overstate the case. There has been very broad support for Israel in the American community since the creation of Israel. It transcends the American Jewish community and so on. So there's no question about that there has been a strong pro-Israel majority in the United States, which for most of the history I've been very glad, although right now it is not helpful to Israel or to American national interests. But having said that, and I know Steve has written, and there are others, John Mearsheimer has written, and there is evidence that some of this support is now waning in any case, and that therefore public opinion would no longer be an obstacle. I mean, if Obama wanted to say, no chance he's going to say this, but if Obama wanted to say that we're making our aid conditional upon Israel agreeing to a two-state settlement, I don't think the American public would rise up in arms and say, we refuse to allow it. That's not going to happen. But the American Jewish community would. And there's no counterweight. Who is the counterweight? There's no strong Arab or Palestinian lobby which can weigh that. So the politics are almost all on the side of the continue the policy no matter what the cost. The only way I can see that is if the American Jewish community becomes convinced that this is not good for Israel. And there's all kinds of Israelis, wonderful Israelis, who've been begging the American Jewish community, stop this. You're harming us. You have to help save us from ourselves. But they have not been able to convince a majority that that's the case. Now, if you had the American Jewish community now saying that Israel has lost its way, and it is not going to find its way back unless we agree that there has to be visible costs and consequences, and that you will lose your last remaining friend, certainly of any importance in the world, unless this would change the politics of the situation. It's not just politics. People also believe. I'm convinced that there are many, many congressmen who actually believe that Israel continues to be the victim and so on, and we have to stand up. And their motives are very, very good. But the consequences of their misunderstandings of the situation are very severe. So I still think it is the Jewish community that you have to start, and that's where, if any change is going to occur, it's got to be there, and the rest of it will follow.
I'm sorry, Adam, do you want the last word? We have to break for lunch now.
Yeah.
So.
Actually, I have nothing to add to that.
Oh, okay. Well, Professor Slater has kindly offered to continue the conversation.
Thank you.